Dame cuando tengas todo listo. Está todo listo. I'm going to speak in Spanish and English. So, buenas tardes, bienvenidas todas, bienvenidos todos a esta nueva sesión académica del grupo sobre los asuntos espaciales. Esta es una sesión espacial y especial, porque les damos el lujo de contar con la presencia del doctor David Reinecke, oficial de Asuntos Exteriores del Departamento de Estado de Estados Unidos y quien se desempeña en la Oficina de Asuntos Espaciales. Y creo que es la primera vez que en el CARI tenemos una astronauta y artista, la doctora Hacia. Así que queremos agradecer la presencia de ellos y también contamos con la presencia del director ejecutivo y técnico de la CONAE, nuestra agencia espacial, el ingeniero Raúl Kulichevsky. Bueno, antes de entrar en la agenda, quiero agradecer a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos por el esfuerzo y la colaboración dada, sobre todo en manos de Aaron Tiffany, para que este encuentro sea posible. Así que muchas gracias por esta colaboración. Y por supuesto agradecer a Beatriz Neufeld, la directora del Comité de los Asuntos de Estados Unidos y del CARI, por acompañarnos, y por supuesto a todos los miembros de los distintos comités del CARI. Hoy vamos a empezar a tratar un tema que habíamos ya comentado en ocasiones anteriores, pero nos encontramos en tiempos donde la cooperación internacional es un pilar fundamental. Nadie en la actividad espacial hace las cosas solo. Así que la cooperación se torna indispensable. En esta nueva etapa, que se ha iniciado con el regreso del ser humano a la Luna, la exploración, y un nuevo issue que encontramos que es la explotación y extracción de recursos espaciales, entre otros, se abren nuevos desafíos. Desde este grupo espacial entendemos que los acuerdos Artemis son sin duda un modelo de cooperación internacional que no podíamos dejar de abordar. Así que hoy será este kickoff de una serie de encuentros donde vamos a tratar los distintos aspectos en torno a ello. Y nos complace ahora sí invitar a la doctora Proctor a iniciar su presentación. I apologize, gentlemen, but Dr. Program, as a woman, as an astronaut, and an artist, has my full attention. Dr. Cian Proctor es la primera mujer afroamericana, científica, educadora y artista en pilotar una nave espacial en la misión Inspiration 4 de SpaceX en 2021. Cuenta con títulos avanzados en ciencias ambientales, geología, educación científica, y el arte forma parte de su vida. Como profesora de geociencias en Maricopa Community College, perfeccionó su capacidad para comunicar ideas complejas a través de la expresión creativa, sentando las bases para su estilo artístico. Su nuevo trabajo nos desafía a considerar el futuro de la humanidad entre las estrellas y al mismo tiempo aborda los problemas más urgentes de la humanidad en la Tierra, desde la gestión ecológica hasta la inclusión y la diversidad. A través de su proyecto Space 2 Inspire, aboga por la diversidad en el espacio y en los campos STEAM, inspirando a los jóvenes y adultos alrededor del mundo a ver la Tierra y el futuro de la humanidad a través de una lente inclusiva. Si me disculpan, porque fue un error de mi parte que no quise hablar, voy a ceder la palabra a Beatriz Neufeld, quien va a dar las palabras de bienvenida. Bueno.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Carolina. Muchas gracias, Cian, doctor Raúl Kulichevsky y David Reinecke por estar acá. Bueno, es para mí un gran honor darle la bienvenida a todos ustedes como directora del Comité de Estados Unidos, teniendo esta importante delegación de los Estados Unidos, y bueno, la presencia también del responsable, ¿no?, de la oficina de CONAE en Argentina. Simplemente quiero solo decir porque ellos son los que nos tienen que hablar, pero que como coincido con Carolina, este es un tema clave para nuestro futuro, para el futuro de la humanidad, para el futuro del planeta, y lo tenemos que abordar con cooperación y con más cooperación, y eventualmente de esta cooperación saldrá un marco legal, regulatorio, ¿no? Para asegurar que la exploración del espacio es en beneficio de la humanidad y del planeta Tierra. Muchas gracias.
Así vamos a escuchar a la doctora pronto, que como verá la audiencia, no son jóvenes, niños, yo me incluyo, ya no estoy en la mayoría jóvenes, pero quienes estamos aquí seguramente tenemos la responsabilidad de inspirar a los más jóvenes, así que muchas gracias por participar en este encuentro.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here to share with you my Space to Inspire story. And I flew to space in 2021 with SpaceX. And when we historically think about human space exploration, the first thing that we often think about is NASA and NASA astronauts. But what we're seeing right now is this amazing shift towards commercial astronauts and access to space by civilians, which is really kind of changing the landscape of the way in which we think about who will go to space on this return to the moon and then on to Mars. NASA and civil astronauts are going to be there leading the way, but quickly following them are going to be the civilian astronauts who are going to have the means and capabilities to go on this journey too. And for me, I think that's really exciting, specifically when we think about access and democratization to space. I want to put into context what happened in the United States on this private commercial side. Of course, in 2010, I think it was, we retired the shuttle program. And as a result, NASA astronauts were going to Russia to be able to go and access the ISS on the Soyuz. And the United States consciously put it in NASA in a call out for the next vehicle that would take astronauts to the International Space Station, this amazing place that we created through international cooperation. And SpaceX was able to finally answer that call in May of 2020 when Bob and Doug did the return to flight from the United States. How many of you watched that or remember that? And during COVID, you know, SpaceX launched their first humans to space. And then quickly after that, in the fall of 2020, still during COVID, SpaceX launched the first Crew 1, which was NASA astronauts again. And then in I think it was April of 2021, SpaceX launched Crew 2 for NASA. But none of us could have imagined that SpaceX's fourth ever human launch would be an all-civilian crew. Privately funded all-civilian crew as the fourth ever human launch by SpaceX. And that has set up this new era of thinking about how we can go advance human spaceflight, not just from the government and the civil side of NASA and agencies like that, but also how do we advance human spaceflight from the civilian side and commercial space sector. And when I think about that change, I'm astonished at the fact that in 2021, not only was I able to go to space, but I was able to do it in a non-conventional way. I won a contest to space. Think about that. The first all-civilian mission to orbit, and 3 of the seats were given away to civilians as a result, and opening up access and this whole idea of democratizing space. And so I was very fortunate that I got selected to go because of Twitter. I won a Twitter contest to space. So a lot of people are like, okay, Twitter, but I won a Twitter contest to space. And the thing about it is that I'm qualified to become an astronaut. I was a finalist for the NASA astronaut selection process in 2009. And I got down to that yes/no phone call, but it was a no. And then you're looking at 12 years later, the fact that I was able to go to space as a commercial astronaut. And the way that I did that, again, being non-conventional, because things are changing rapidly. And how we need to think about the future that we want to have as we go to the moon and Mars and beyond. We're writing the narrative now. And as we write that narrative and what it's going to look like, we need to do that in a way that we create what I call a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, or a JEDI space for all of humanity. And when I think about the framework of the Artemis Accords, that's what's setting us up to be successful in this space. As we start thinking about partnerships of how we're going to go back to the moon and then on to Mars, and how we do that in a way that is for all of humanity. And we do that not just for all of humanity, but as we're solving for space, we're solving for Earth. And the whole idea that what we do out there has an impact of what and how we're going to be sustainable here on Earth. And so a lot of you are probably wondering, like, Inspiration 4, how many know about Inspiration 4, what that was? Raise your hand if you followed the Inspiration 4 mission. Some people really have, but most of you are like, I don't have any clue. Well, as you know, SpaceX and Elon Musk's #1 goal is go to Mars. But in order to go to Mars, you gotta go to the moon. And before you go to the moon, you gotta go to low Earth orbit. And so Inspiration 4, if we play this video, this is what Inspiration 4 is.
The delay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. 2021, I launched to space for 3 days with Inspiration 4. So it was an orbital mission in the Dragon.
So we lived in and did our work in the Dragon Capsule for those 3 days. But to just put into context some of the historical things that are coming out of that successful mission. Because we were successful, my commander, Jared Isaacman, who is the billionaire who paid for my mission as a civilian, just went back to space and did the first all-civilian spacewalk just 2 months ago. And now the Trump administration has picked him to be the next administrator of NASA. A private citizen is now going to be head of NASA, who has gone to space for the commercial side. That's how things are changing rapidly and access is changing. And it's really important that I feel like with Artemis that we all need to come together and start voicing the type of world that we want to create as we go to the moon and Mars and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions for you. Maybe we can continue
with the Artemis Accords and the end, ask the questions, finally ask the questions.
Or if people want to ask questions now, I think we should do it.
Okay. This is one question. Is why choose in the middle? Leo, your name.
And so my call sign is Leo. And the way you get your call sign is that you go to fighter jet training when you're training to become an astronaut. And after you've successfully made it through fighter jet training, you have a call sign ceremony where your crew members and support staff suggest names for you. And so I won my seat again as an artist and a poet by writing a poem called Space to Inspire. And so one person stood up and said, I think Cyan should be, her call sign should be Picasso. And everybody, because she's an artist, Picasso. And everybody's like, yeah, and you're sitting in a chair. I was like, Picasso, that's kind of cool. And then the next guy stood up and said, no, Cyan is not a Picasso. She does art and science. She's a modern day Renaissance woman. She is a Leonardo da Vinci. And everybody went, Leo. And that's how I got my call sign, is because I do art and science.
Nice history. I don't know if you want to continue with the question with the Dr. Proctor, or you prefer to start with your presentation. At the end, ask
Sure.
everybody the questions for all of you.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
Vamos a hacer una pequeña digresión en el orden de la presentación. Vamos a, para que puedan hacer preguntas integrales, vamos a presentar ahora qué es esto de Artemis. Y va a tomar la palabra David Ripnicke, quien va a explicarnos los acuerdos del programa Artemis, los acuerdos Artemis. Luego el ingeniero Policheski va a dar la visión un poco desde la Argentina que se integra a estos acuerdos, y al final ya podemos hacer las preguntas a los tres. Por favor.
¿La presentación la tenés?
Well, thank you, Carolina, and to Beatrice and to Kari, and for the incredible crowd that has come out today. It's a tough act to follow when you're following a living astronaut, but I will try to do my best coming from the State Department. I'm just a humble diplomat, not someone who's been to space like Cyan. But I thought it was helpful when Carolina introduced this event to give a little bit of background on the Artemis Accords and Artemis program. So what you're going to see here is basically the series of slides that we give to countries when they're interested in joining the Artemis Accords. So if a country comes to us and says, what is the Artemis Accords all about? You're going to see a bridged version of exactly the presentation that we give. It's working. Okay, so what are the Artemis Accords? They were created in October 2020 in the midst of COVID. But what it is I think it's a promise, it's a vision, and it's a shared vision for the future of what the peaceful exploration and use of outer space can look like, driven by shared values like safety, sustainability, transparency, trying to encourage countries to have a policy conversation about how we want space exploration to look like as we go to the moon and beyond, as Simon was talking about. Put my Ministry of Foreign Affairs hat on really quickly. It is a non-binding whole of government and political commitment to advance these particular principles. It's not a treaty, it's not a bilateral agreement with the United States. Really, it is this non-binding political commitment. These principles, there's 10 of them. It's actually very short to read if you read the Artemis Accords. They don't come from nowhere. They're principally based on the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the foundation of international space law. But other treaties, other agreements, and best practices that space agencies like NASA, CONAI, JAXA, ESA, and others have learned as they've worked in space over the past decades. As the namesake implies, so Artemis Accords, they were inspired by the Artemis missions, but they're separate from that, right? They're not one and the same. The Artemis Accords are meant to be the policy conversation around space exploration, whereas the Artemis missions, as I'll talk about in a little bit, is NASA's program to go back to the moon and beyond with international partners. It was launched in 2020 by 8 countries, and you can see the signing ceremony up at the top. It was done in COVID, so everyone was having to do it virtually. But subsequently, we've shifted back to in-person signing ceremonies. I believe that's Chile at the bottom, one of our more recent signatories. So from 8 countries in 2020, I think the vision has resonated with the international community in the capacities. This is my favorite slide I like to give when I give this presentation. And you can see from these 8 countries, we've grown now to 48. And I know we'll probably be 50 before the end of the year, the next month or so. And if you took Artemis Accords away from this, right, and you just looked at all these flags, all these countries, I think it would be difficult to guess what all these countries are doing together. This is a very unusual group of countries, right? All over the world, countries with established space capabilities, countries that haven't even created space agencies yet, right? Countries coming from lots of different perspectives, lots of different interests, but sharing this common vision, right? The peaceful exploration and use of outer space. And as I was saying, I think it's resonated because you've seen the Accords grow dramatically over the past several years. And probably with any luck, will continue to grow in the years to come. As I suggested, the namesake is implied or it's connected back to the Artemis series of missions. What is the Artemis series of missions? Well, it's a NASA program in partnership with international partners all over the world and commercial partners as well, trying to build the biggest coalition to date to send people back to the moon and beyond. And something that I want to emphasize, and Cyan, you set me up perfectly for this, is that if you look back to Project Apollo in the 1960s, this is really one country kind of acting alone, right, exploring space. Artemis is a different vision. It's saying we can go together and we can do so in a responsible way. So the Artemis Accords informs the program informs the Artemis Accords in a certain way, but again, they are separate. Something to emphasize, and I think this also resonates with you, Cyan, one of the key aspects or something I'm very excited about the Artemis series of missions intends to send the first woman and the first person of color and the first non-US astronaut to space, right? So it really is that Jedi space realized in practice, right? Taking very seriously the inclusive nature of how we want space exploration to look like. Why sign the Artemis Accords? So something that we've done with the community of countries that have signed on is ask them, why did you sign the Artemis Accords? What was in it for you? What drew you to this particular vision or message? What are the kinds of benefits that a country might get when it comes to signing the Artemis Accords? So we sent a questionnaire around to all the different countries and got back a lot of very interesting responses. And here's an example of some of them. I think first and foremost, joining the Accords sends a clear political signal to the world of a country's commitment, right, to that peaceful vision for space exploration. In turn, many countries have used signing the Accords as a way to kind of launch new space initiatives, space strategies, sometimes rethinking their space agencies. Korea, for example, comes to mind. They signed the Artemis Accords right at the time that they were creating the Korean Space Agency. So they're using this as a broader package of space policies to kind of announce, hey, we're doing something new, we're doing something different. In turn, joining the Artemis Accords would raise the domestic profile of a particular space program, which in turn leads to more resources, and then, really the coin of the realm, broader economic and technological development. So it is a policy conversation, but it's driving broader attention to space programs, and I think in a very beneficial and self-sustaining way. These are particular case studies of individual countries. I won't get into them now, but lots of interesting data that we've collected from participating countries. Two more slides. So something I also want to emphasize, especially when we're telling countries about the Artemis Accords, and Raul can attest to this because he was at this particular meeting at the IAC. The Accords is not just a piece of paper, right? It's not just a political commitment. It's also an active community dedicated to the implementation of the principles of the Artemis Accords. So bringing the community together to talk about the sharing of scientific data, bringing the community together to talk about how transparency would work in space, how we can avoid harmful interference, right? So we don't run our rovers into each other. What can we do in order to enhance the peaceful uses of outer space, right? The kind of core principles. And so what started as a political commitment has now grown into this very active community that meets regularly online and in person. We meet regularly in a series of workshops. We now have a so-called heads of agency or principals meeting that happens on the margins of the International Astronautical Congress. This is the big space event, international space event of the year. And I took this picture at the bottom. I was sitting at the table with all the other space agency heads, pretending to be one. And you can see the kind of the bird's eye view of what that looked like. And this group, I think, caught many, at least within NASA and the State Department, by surprise. I think initially when we created this, there was no sense that it would be this active community necessarily, but really we've received a very strong demand signal from the community that people want to talk about these issues. Communities want to come together, countries want to come together to begin to articulate what it is that the Accords mean and how we can implement them in practice. And I'm really excited to see this group, not only, meet, figure things out, but begin to actually produce real work over time. For example, the signatories came together and identified a set of mission data that can be released voluntarily by countries in order to avoid harmful interference on the moon. And so the United States, India, and Japan, 3 countries that have launched moon missions very recently, took that mission data and then submitted it to the UN as part of this, transparency and confidence building measure. So taking the work that we're doing in the Accords and actually implementing it in practice. And at least from a kind of space agency or Ministry of Foreign Affairs perspective, pretty impressive that we've got that kind of work done, that we can get people to agree and then actually see it happen in practice. And I expect in the years to come, these kinds of regular meetings will only increase, and the kind of work that we will be doing will be widely shared as we're doing here at events like this today. Last one, and this is something that's come from giving this presentation many, many times to interested countries, a kind of frequently asked questions. And I know we're saving questions to the end, Carolina.
Okay.
But I'll just hit them very, very quickly, and then turn it back over to Raul. The Accords, again, are not a formal legally binding treaty, right? Not a bilateral agreement with the US, but rather a political commitment. It is a form of soft law, to put it another way. This is important, right? Speaking back to science interest about inclusiveness, there's no financial obligations or required spacefaring capabilities to join the Artemis Accords. You do not have to have a mission plan to go to the moon anytime soon to be a part of this community. We recognize and recommend and welcome voices from all over the world that have equities in trying to define what the future of space exploration is going to look like, and really welcome these voices saying, maybe we don't have a moon mission today, but we can still benefit from the scientific data that comes from that moon mission. Or maybe in 5, 10, 20 years' time, we will too be on the moon and want to benefit from this framework that we're talking about today. So we want a seat at the table to continue. Importantly, the Accords are intended only to apply to civil space activities conducted by civil space agencies, right? So there is this wide and growing world of commercial space. The Accords do not have much to say about that. Maybe one day you could imagine an Accords for civil space or national security space, right? These are other areas of space activities that are probably very important, probably need similar kinds of frameworks or policy discussions. But as written, it really is intended only to apply to civil space activities. Finally, again, with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, people in the House, and I see people who used to be in Vienna over there. The Accords are not intended to replace or go around existing multilateral organizations, right, such as the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. This is the premier multilateral fora where we talk about and debate space policy issues, right? So at the end of the day, that's probably where it's all going to go. And the Accords are not meant to kind of go around that or, preclude those kinds of conversations. They're there to. Finally, and I've hit this multiple times, not a bilateral agreement with the US. The United States is not the Accords owner. We don't get to select who gets to join. Any country that wants to make this political commitment can do so, any country. However, we are happy to do things like this, to do briefings, to tell people what the Accords are. Assist in signing ceremonies. So you saw the example of Chile earlier. And we serve as the repository of signatures. So that's our small role within this community. But really, everyone has an equal voice around the particular table or in this particular community. And I think we're better off for doing that. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions at the end, and I'll turn it back over to you, Carolina.
Thanks.
Vamos a darle la palabra ahora a Cheki. Vamos a empezar así con esta ronda de incorporación de cada uno de los países signatarios, que van a ir contando un poco desde su perspectiva que empezar a Artemis, y bueno, en este caso lo hacemos desde Argentina.
Bueno, yo no tengo una presentación, voy a contar un poquito el por qué Argentina es parte de los acuerdos de Artemis. Y lo primero que tengo que decir es que Argentina es parte de los acuerdos de Artemis porque es un paso natural a lo que ha sido la cooperación internacional de la Argentina en el sector espacial. CONAE nació en el ámbito, de alguna manera, de la Cancillería, porque desde el mismo inicio se entendió que el desarrollo del sector espacial en Argentina tenía que ser con cooperación internacional. Y así lo ha sido desde la creación de CONAE en el año 1991. Entonces, en particular, bueno, entre Estados Unidos y sin duda el crecimiento de CONAE tiene mucho que ver con la cooperación, principalmente con NASA, pero a lo largo de los años no solo con NASA, con el US, con NOVA, o sea, con muchas instituciones de Estados Unidos, pero cooperación internacional muy abarcativa. Hoy la CONAE tiene más de 190 acuerdos internacionales con distintos países, organizaciones. Somos parte del Charter Internacional, que es una organización para tratar de asistir a través de información satelital cuando hay una emergencia internacional donde hay vidas humanas en peligro. Argentina es parte de eso, o sea que la cooperación internacional es sin duda parte de la CONAE. Entonces, el por qué estar en Artemis era casi un paso natural dentro de esa cooperación. Por otro lado, estamos viviendo una era que sin duda está revolucionando lo que va a ser el desarrollo de la humanidad y la vuelta del hombre a la Luna y de conquistar otros planetas. Entonces también ahí aparecen preguntas de, bueno, pero ¿por qué la Argentina tiene que estar en eso? Cuando estamos pensando y cuando vivimos situaciones muy difíciles. Y por un lado, yo creo que hay dos cuestiones. Por un lado está la cuestión más institucional, como David recién mencionaba. En definitiva, los acuerdos de Artemis son una serie de digamos, disposiciones no vinculantes respecto de lo que va a ser en el futuro la convivencia en la Luna. Convivencia que sin duda no va a ser fácil. Los principios de Artemis establecen cuestiones sobre las que todo el mundo en principio principio, obviamente todos los que firmamos estamos de acuerdo, pero que sin embargo no está exento de desafíos, y los desafíos están en la letra chica, en la implementación. Y entonces la participación de la Argentina, con una enorme trayectoria de discusión en los ámbitos multilaterales, en el sector espacial, sin duda que tiene para aportar en esa visión de cómo se van a realizar esas implementaciones. Por otra parte, también Hacia hablaba de la importancia del sector privado. Y la Argentina creo que hoy puede mostrar con orgullo, luego de más de 30 años de desarrollo en el sector espacial, también un sector privado que ha demostrado sus capacidades de poder desarrollar distintas capacidades que han sido probadas en vuelo. En definitiva, buena parte de los satélites que hemos desarrollado en CONAE se han hecho con colaboración de empresas argentinas y con colaboración del sistema científico-tecnológico argentino, y que ha demostrado la capacidad de no solo poder pensar, de poder imaginar, de poder diseñar, sino de poder demostrar que las cosas funcionaron luego en el espacio. Y no muchos países pueden mostrar esa capacidad. Entonces, desde el punto de vista también de la promoción del sector privado, de cómo a través de el accionar de la parte institucional, del gobierno, de la actividad de CONAE, de cómo podemos apoyar a las empresas argentinas para ser parte de ese futuro que está a la vuelta de la esquina, creo que sin duda es otra justificación de por qué Argentina tiene que estar o ser parte de los acuerdos de Artemis, como así también, como mencionaba David, no solo en los acuerdos de Artemis, sino seguir discutiendo en los organismos multilaterales como Naciones Unidas, OCUS, porque hay que dar también ese paso, y es parte de lo que se está discutiendo hoy en las mesas. Hay muchas charlas en Artemis de, bueno, cómo también va a ser luego ese acercamiento entre estas cuestiones que estamos discutiendo en los signatarios de Artemis, cómo de alguna manera se van a complementar con lo que sean las reglamentaciones internacionales ya establecidas y que se tienen que establecer hacia el futuro. Y después hay un tercer plan que tiene que ver con las personas, porque hablamos de las instituciones, hablamos de las empresas, y también hablamos de las personas, porque hoy estábamos hablando con Hacia, con David, con Aaron, de una chica argentina que está instalada en la Florida, que trabaja en el área de biomedicina y que quiere ser la primera astronauta argentina. Quiere ir al espacio y que en su costado esté la bandera argentina, y por supuesto estamos tratando de apoyarla en ese sentido. Pero además, y volviendo también a lo que es el sector privado, volver el regreso del hombre a la Luna o luego a otros planetas no está exento de enormes desafíos. Una cosa es ir a la Luna y volver, otra es establecerse en la Luna, otra es poder vivir en la Luna, otra es poder vivir en otros planetas. Y para eso hay enormes desafíos para desarrollar. Y simplemente para comentarnos que a lo mejor a nosotros nos resultan naturales por la capacidad de nuestro país. ¿Cómo se van a alimentar? ¿Cómo se van a producir alimentos en las colonias de la Luna? ¿Cómo se van a cuidar las personas, digamos, que están en la Luna? Entonces, nosotros desde un país que sin duda tiene una actividad en el sector agropecuario de enorme capacidad, de enorme tecnología, cada vez incorpora más tecnología, no me cabe ninguna duda que también la Argentina puede aportar a esos desafíos. Entonces, bueno, no quiero extenderme mucho más porque en definitiva acá la estrella Chayanne, y estoy seguro que todos están esperando la oportunidad de poder charlar con ella. Yo ya tuve la oportunidad y todavía tengo un montón de preguntas para hacer, pero nada, sin duda, dejar de alguna manera volver a evidenciar esto. La Argentina ha sido parte de la cooperación internacional desde la década del 60, todavía más desde la creación de CONAE en la década del 90, y queremos seguir siendo parte de esto, y la Argentina tiene que ser parte de esto, porque se nos vienen tiempos absolutamente disruptivos y sería una locura no ser parte de todo eso. Así que, bueno, nada, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. No sé si
Bueno, yo en realidad yo tengo preguntas.
Vamos a las preguntas entonces.
Bueno, nuevamente agradezco los comentarios de cada uno. Realmente creo que ha sido aleccionador y una exploración del futuro. Y bueno, y tengo algunas preguntas para Hacia. Una pregunta es, ¿cómo es vivir esos días? ¿Cómo fue vivir esos días? ¿Cómo las cuestiones naturales que mencionaba Raúl, alimentarse, otras cuestiones, digamos, cómo es? Esa es una pregunta. Y la otra, o sea, me destacaste la importancia que tiene la exploración comercial del espacio. Dado que vos accediste a ser astronauta en función de que te financiaron, digamos, desde el sector privado, ¿vos en qué ves que esto agrega, además de la exploración civil del espacio? ¿Qué puede agregar más? ¿Qué valor agregado adicional puede traer la participación comercial del sector privado en el espacio? It's a difficult question that you want me to.
You only have 2 minutes.
I'll start with the second question about how the commercial sector has to contribute to civil space.
Yes.
And a lot of that is towards what I call that Jedi space, that just equitable, diverse, and inclusive space. And what I mean by this is that in the last 3 years, commercial space has flown 15% of all the women who have gone into space. And so this is access that we did not have before in a way that enables us to provide inspiration for women in that idea of going back to the moon and beyond. But a lot of times I look at the women in the room here and raise your hand if you would go to space, right? Now, how many of you believe that you have that access in your lifetime? Right? And you're saying no. But now commercial space is enabling that to happen in a way that wasn't available in what I call traditional space, where you had to be the best of the best in order to go. Haley Arsenal, my crew member, childhood cancer survivor, has a prosthesis in her leg. Would not have been able to go to space if it wasn't for commercial space. So people who have disabilities, people who thought that they would never be able to make it, people who are artists, people who are a seasoned individual, my goodness, we sent Captain Kirk, William Shatner, to space, right? He was 90 years old. We sent Wally Funk, one of the Mercury 13, during the NASA Apollo missions. There were women who qualified to become astronauts, and the door was shut on them and said no by Congress. Our United States Congress shut the door on that. And then one of those women got to fly to space on a commercial ticket. And again, was gifted that ticket. The first African-American male that was selected to go to space under Kennedy. This was back in '63, I believe. Kennedy's assassination derailed his chance of becoming an astronaut. He is now the oldest individual to go to space. He flew earlier this year to space with a commercial space provider. And so it's this amazing opportunity for us to really think about how do we make space for all. And then if you look at my crew, one of the interesting things is, we were talking about this earlier, is There have been a lot of people who've gone to space, but a lot of that bio data of the astronauts is protected. And we don't have access to that openly in the medical community globally. But with Inspiration 4, we made all of our data that we collected available. And now we have an open database of regular people flying to space. And what are those? Do you have to be perfect to go to space? And the answer is no. You don't have to be perfect, but what are those limitations? How old can you be? What if you're diabetic? What if you have a previous medical issue? Can you still become flight ready and go? And commercial space is answering that question. And these are some of the fun and interesting things that are coming down the pipeline as a result of commercial space and access. I met the first Mexican-born woman to go to space, commercial space. I've met the first Egyptian woman and the first woman from the continent of Africa. She went to space in the last 3 years, commercial space. And it's really exciting to think about how a lot of these individuals who are going to space aren't rich. They're finding there are companies and individuals who are stepping up and saying, we need to democratize space, we need more access. We're going to open it up for anybody in the world to be able to go and have this experience and not have to pay for it. And that's exciting. So all of you that raise your hand, there is opportunity. I will tell you the first one that you need to look and Google this now, SREA Space, SREA.space. They bought out a Blue Origin capsule and they are committed to sending people who have never been, people from nations who have never had an astronaut go to space. They're committed to sending them to space first.
So nice.
Mm-hmm. And then the second one, do something better than floating in space. So, like what it's like to actually go to space, it is awesome. I'm just gonna say, I highly recommend it. You know, I mean, I gave 5 stars. I gave 5 stars on TripAdvisor. People say I don't look my age because I'm in my mid-50s, and I tell them Earth flight. There's nothing better than being bathed in Earth light to help you stay young. Living in a Dragon capsule for 3 days, I think the biggest thing for me is not just looking at the Earth and doing all the research and all of that, but when you're living there, you've got to eat, you've got to sleep. Now imagine you're going to go to sleep and you never once think about needing a pillow. Think about that, because you can be in any orientation. Your head doesn't feel gravity, your body doesn't feel gravity, so you don't need a pillow. And those are the little things that being able to live in space, you're kind of like shocked by. And so fantastic experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Vamos a las preguntas de sí. Pedro, ahí levantó la mano.
Well, thank you very much. This is really exciting. It's a new frontier which is coming much faster than everybody thinks.
Yes.
Because the programs to go and have someone leaving or at least staying for long periods in the moon and then on to Mars. It is you, the Chinese, and others that are thinking of that. And some of the dates that I have seen for the moon, they speak about 2030. So that's tomorrow morning. And so that obviously we needed something that many of the governments of today do not want to listen to, which is regulation, but because something has to be done, because there are tensions between some of the countries that have the possibilities to go to the moon. And those tensions have to be somehow diminished in order to really make the space, the use of the space really available for all. And we have one experience that is very good and which you are familiar, which is Antarctica. Antarctica has been kept out of the conflicts even during the Cold War, and so probably that's a model that can be use, but that's something that has to be, everybody has to be striving to get there, because otherwise it will be a big problem. And one of the things that I want also to ask you is, to ask you both, is the question of the experience in the International Space Station. That's not for, it's not like to live in an extraterrestrial body, let's say, like in the moon or whatever. But obviously there was a longer period there in order to the experience must have been very useful to determine whether you can feed when you are there, you can do all the things that Beatrice suggested without asking, going into the specifics. That has been, surely that's been a great experience to see how will these people perform when they are living or staying for longer periods in the moon, in Mars, or whatever. No?
Yeah, I would actually say that going to the International Space Station and staying there, which is another excellent example of the nations cooperating to create the ISS is one of the most amazing technological achievements that humans have been able to do, to go up and live and work in space and do that with multiple nations coming together to do that. When we talk about the International Space Station and floating in space, I think one of the big things that has been the biomedical, how the human body reacts to that floating environment. But when we're talking about going back to the moon and we're in a tenth of Earth's gravity, there are really different issues that we have to overcome and learn how to do. We visited the moon, but now we're going to stay. And so what is that going to look like? And how do we do it well? And how do we scale that up so that it's not just 5, 6, maybe 7 people living in an International Space Station? Could we have a day where we have lunar habitats with a large number of individuals living there? And I think when you talk about analogs for that, Antarctica is an excellent example of that. And this whole idea of what is a good analog for the moon, and how can countries start to contribute towards success on the moon and Mars through setting up analog research stations within their own country, where we can research things like crew cohesion and telemedicine and all other food, growing food under those kinds of conditions. We can simulate a lot of those things. We can't simulate the 1/10 gravity, but there's so much more that we have to figure out in order to be successful on the moon and on Mars. And we can do that through analog sites. So I think when we're looking at the LEO, low Earth orbit, there are things that benefit us from the human body and research and stuff, especially pharmaceutical. But I really think a lot of our prep work for the moon begins here on Earth through these analogs.
Yeah, and I'll just say very quickly, I love those historical analogies, Antarctica and ISS, clear parallels. There's probably lots of lessons learned to be gained, not only practically in terms of like working together, like what's the frequency we use if there's an emergency, right? Like practical stuff like that, but then also broader policy frameworks that might be useful. There's probably also important differences, right? So the issue of resources on Antarctica, we might end up in a different place when it comes to the moon, right? If we're going to stay on the moon, we probably will have to figure out a way to use resources to be there in a sustainable fashion. Not strip mining the moon in any way, but actually use the moon resources in a transparent and sustainable fashion. The ISS is another great example. Part of the Artemis series of missions includes this idea of the Lunar Gateway, which is a space station to be built by the ISS partners, -1. You can imagine who that one is, plus another country, which is the UAE. But something that I found fascinating is rather than negotiate a new agreement, right, amongst all the different people making that space station, they just took the International Space Station Agreement and then added an annex to it, or an MOU. So it's not only just an historical analogy, it's actually the framework that's going to facilitate future lunar exploration. Maybe one day we need something broader than that. And then I think, then again, we would also look back to the experiences of Antarctica for how that kind of got put together. But I completely take your point, and I think it's a great one.
¿Otra pregunta?
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the opportunity to do today. And I wanted to highlight something that you said earlier when we were planning, and that was about how all this experience that is going into space will be reflected on the benefit or progress that we are facing here on Earth. Because that it is a point that can make us relate to this seemingly remote idea of why should we go. It's not only just going, it's also something very important for our life here. I wanted to ask about training for civilians, because we have the idea that training for astronauts that we've seen in movies, it's how that does this work for civilians?
Those are two really fantastic questions. The first one I'll deal with the training part first, and talking about training is amazing to me that I got selected to go to space in March of 2021, and I lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in September of 2021. You can do the math on that, right? So we're talking less than 6 months. For me and my crew, 4 strangers came together in March of 2021. We did not know each other, and successfully trained through SpaceX for this orbital mission. And that's a testament to how quickly the technology is changing to enable that type of rapid turnaround and access. And so for me, me and my commander as the mission pilot, we had the most training, because we would go to Hawthorne, SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California, and we had simulated training for the Dragon capsule's flight simulators. Because now with automated systems, it's not about as a pilot, stick and rudder and all of those kinds of things. It's about understanding the Falcon 9 system and the Dragon capsule, and how the flight computers run through all of its sequences, and what happens if the flight computers go down. And there's triple redundancy in that system. And so that's where most of the learning, particularly for me, because I'm not a systems engineer, I'm a geologist, a geoscience professor. So I had stacks of books that I had to read to learn about all of these systems and stuff. But I could do it. I got certified for flight. Now you can imagine this. I win a contest to space via Twitter. I show up at SpaceX headquarters and they're like, you may have won a contest to space, but if you do not qualify as a mission pilot, you do not fly. And you're like, what does that mean? How do I qualify as a mission pilot? But they were able to get me qualified within 6 months. And I see that the time and the amount of time needed for training is coming less. It's not getting more. Because as we learn and we send more and more people to space, we learn what is the minimum amount of training that you need to have, and then how can that be assisted. And then with AI, that's a game changer too, because now you're getting to the point where you're going to be going to space with AI assistance too, which is going to have another whole kind of 2001 Space Odyssey. But the reality is that that's going to be able to assist you in real time if something is happening and you need help in understanding or explaining it. And so the cognitive load for astronauts is changing because how much do you have to memorize versus being able to access information? Obviously, astronauts these days, a lot of times in the past, they literally had procedures that they worked through step by step. And then now, how much of those procedures will be AI enhanced to help in real time figure things out? So it's really interesting to see how that landscape is going to change and make us hopefully successful as we advance human space flight. Now, the other reason, why do we do this? Solving for space is solving for Earth. I'm a geoscientist. There is no better planet than Earth, you know, and so me wanting to be an astronaut wasn't because I want to abandon Earth, it's because I want to see Earth become better and more sustainable, and us as humans becoming better stewards of our planet through space exploration. We're going back to the moon and then on to Mars, but we're going to stay, and we don't know how to do that. What is the best energy resource for the moon? What's the best wastewater recycling for the moon? What is the best way to use resources sustainably from the moon? These are questions we don't know how to answer right now, but we need to. And so when we think about humans going to the moon and then on to Mars, it is all about efficiency. It's efficiency in food, water, energy, resource management, and waste management. Efficiencies in all of those systems in order for us not only to survive, but to thrive. And what do we have problems with here on Earth? Food, water, energy, resource management, waste management. And as we push humanity to the moon and onto Mars, we are going to develop all of this technology and knowledge to solve these wicked problems here on Earth. And the person who comes up with the solution might be in Argentina. We don't know unless we give them the opportunity to try to solve these problems, giving the next generation these issues and saying, look, you want to save Earth or make Earth better? Come over and work in the space sector and help us figure out how to feed people on Mars, because that technology is going to spin off and help us feed people here on Earth. And those are the things where a lot of times we don't think about that disconnect between space exploration and Earth. But those are the ways in which we make Earth better and more sustainable, is by pushing humanity to the extremes.
I have a question to Raul. Raul and David. Raul said that there is, and also I think David, all that there are implementation challenges. And Raul said that Argentina could contribute to that. So could you just give us an example or a couple of examples regarding the implementation challenges on the Artemis Accords?
Ahí tenemos un problema porque hay un tema de confidencialidad del que se discute. Una de las contribuciones que quiero hacer es que la próxima vez que haya uno de esos encuentros deberían ser bajo las reglas de luego poder contar sin tener que contar primero. Exactamente. Pero a ver, hay sin duda muchos desafíos. Y sin entrar en detalles, una de las cuestiones que se están discutiendo es, bueno, ¿cómo hacemos para que los países que hoy no están siendo parte de los acuerdos de Artemis, porque a lo mejor no se ven como parte de ese futuro, cómo integrarlos, ¿no? Y lo digo desde un país que claramente, digamos, no somos una potencia, más allá de que sí tenemos una historia de muchos años en el sector espacial, pero entonces, desde ese punto de vista, y parte de lo que charlamos a lo mejor con los otros países es que de alguna manera estamos en un lugar privilegiado, de entender a los países que efectivamente están liderando, digamos, todo esto, y de los países que a lo mejor todavía no están, y podemos entender las dos perspectivas, ¿no? Y cómo contribuir desde nuestro sector con nuestra mirada, no solo de decir, bueno, ok, es la mirada de los países centrales, sino la mirada del resto de los países, de cómo todos, la humanidad, digamos, podemos ser parte de esto y cada uno puede hacer su contribución. Y es, creo, volviendo a parte de lo que se decía, yo creo que a veces uno se olvida de cómo el desarrollo del sector espacial ha contribuido, digamos, a nuestra vida, en cosas que pueden resultar triviales, simplemente por nombrar una. Hoy todos, o la mayoría de nosotros, tenemos una olla de teflón en nuestras casas, y el teflón se desarrolló, digamos, como un antiadherente, digamos, para evitar que dos piezas se pegaran, digamos, en algún componente de un satélite, ¿no? Entonces, pero también, entonces, poder acercar esa mirada de un país que sin duda tiene muchas necesidades, pero que al mismo tiempo tiene capacidades, creo que es parte de la contribución que sin duda queremos hacer en todas las charlas, pero hay mucho para andar y recién mencionaban algo que creo que a todos nos preocupa, que es las cosas están sucediendo muchísimo más rápido que el establecimiento de los marcos legales, ¿no? Supongo que no es la primera vez en la historia de la humanidad que las cosas suceden más rápido que los marcos legales. Pero sin duda esto va a ser muy desafiante, sobre todo porque para el sector espacial de un sector que básicamente estaba gobernado, o la gobernanza estaba a cargo de los estados, y ahora el sector privado tiene una injerencia y necesidades que también tienen que ser contempladas. Entonces, es un enorme desafío.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say just 2 quick points about implementation challenges, and everything Raul said is completely right. One is the group itself is an experiment, right? I think it's very hopeful, it's a hopeful vision of the future, but how that group looks, how it's organized, how it's governed is something that is an evolving conversation. And only this year have we gotten to the point where we're thinking about something like a terms of reference, or how the group works and who takes the notes and how do we come to an agreement, right? So that's been something that has taken time to come around. Another thing is that it's principally a policy conversation, but a lot of the issues that we're talking about, especially once you get 1 or 2 levels down, it becomes very technical, right? And so that's something where bringing technical expertise to inform the policy, that will probably continue to be a challenge. And then you add on top of that, have some countries, Japan, for instance, India has a lot of capabilities. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists and engineers that work on these very, very small issues. And then you're sitting across the table from a country whose space agency might have 10 people in it, right? So there's a mismatch sometimes in terms of technical expertise. So how do we share that technical expertise or inform other signatories in order to make smart policy? And that's something that we're going to have to continue to wrestle through. So maybe it's we do workshops, or we do presentations, or we have countries come over and learn from each other on a bilateral basis or something. But getting the right technical expertise, the right technical bodies, and then feeding that into the process to inform what we're going to do. I don't think that's ever going to get easy, but I think we're starting to conceptualize the problem and make progress on it. Thank you. Yeah.
Quizás uno de los desafíos más grandes sea the regulation about the space resources, exploration.
Yeah.
One of the challenges.
That will be a big challenge for sure. Because as I noted in that the slide with all the flags, right? You have lots of countries, lots of diverse opinions. On some things, surprising amounts of agreement. But I would anticipate potentially the issue of space resources is one of these things where it might take a while to get consensus, or the things that we can agree on might be much smaller than the kind of the wider issues. But I'm very hopeful that this group can have a productive conversation on space resources. Even at the end of the day, we might not agree on every single part. Yeah.
Yes. No sé quién levantó la mano.
Yeah.
Bien.
Gracias. Un comentario. You said that commercial partners promote women participation. Well, yo cuando trabajaba en la CONAE fui la negociadora principal para los aspectos jurídicos del contrato de lanzamiento de puesta en órbita de los satélites con SpaceX. esa es un área donde las mujeres podemos proveer, sobre todo porque estamos viviendo una gran evolución en las categorías jurídicas internacionales. Realmente ustedes van a tener que pensar también en las certificaciones SEX y otras certificaciones que se están exigiendo actualmente en los contratos internacionales. Muchas gracias, fue fascinante todas las exposiciones de ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Liliana.
Gracias. Bueno, muchas gracias. Quería consultarles sobre el sistema de referencia de navegación que emplean en la Luna. ¿Cómo acuerdan internacionalmente cuál emplear?
Of the space in time.
It's the youngest. And I
In terms of satellite navigation or like things like GPS or something like that, or?
Yes.
So there's nothing in the Artemis Accords that includes something about GPS or satellite navigation. In many instances, because issues of GNSS on Earth, we have mature systems, we have a way of increasing interoperability, we have ways of coming to an agreement between different providers. There's nothing like that on the moon just yet, right? But that doesn't mean that we might not get to that place. And in fact, for a sustainable presence on the moon, we probably need to start thinking about lunar PNT, position navigation and timing systems. We need to start thinking about lunar space situational awareness, right? Identifying where objects are. But it's still very early days for those kinds of systems. I know on the NASA side, they're beginning to think through what that might look like in practice. They're beginning to try to identify possible standards by which they might in a transparent fashion, share with other countries to see if they can to join onto. But this is one of these issues that if you started to work on it now, you could be at the very beginning stages of it because nobody really knows at the end of the day about how that's going to work on the moon. The last thing I'll say, the White House a couple months ago issued a policy memo that got picked up a lot around the news about calling for at some point in the, I think by the end of the 2020s, we need to figure out how we're going to have a time zone on the moon, right? A kind of, whatever the offset from UTC would be. And that's important, right? For reasons of physics, like the mass of the Earth is different from the mass of the moon. So time moves slower versus faster. So you need some way of capturing that, which is important eventually when you would have satellite navigation systems, right? Because it's all about timing. So that's just a preview of all the really complicated issues that we're going to have to solve if one day we do want to extend satellite navigation to the moon. And would welcome your voice and Kari and others to begin to have that kind of conversation. Because at the end of the day, it serves nobody if a country like the United States just unilaterally decides these things. We need to work together to figure it out.
Muchas gracias. Sí, mi pregunta venía más que nada porque soy analista del Sistema de Información Geográfica y, bueno, me interesaba mucho saber cómo se ubica en la Luna. ¿Qué coordenadas, por ejemplo, usarían para comunicar su ubicación?
Yeah, no, there's no standardized system just yet. There's no geodetic map of the moon that we have on the Earth. So these are all things that we're going to have to do. And we're going to have to do it in coordination and in cooperation with countries all over the world.
David, I have another question. Maybe it's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Are you discussing how are we addressing the issue of property rights in space?
Well, so I think the Outer Space Treaty is unusually clear in that regard, which is to say no national appropriation in space, right? You can't put a flag down and say the moon belongs to us, at least when it comes to celestial objects, right? So that's unusually clear in an often ambiguous document, but it's pretty straightforward. But then the issue of space resources somehow, in certain ways, under certain interpretations, might complicate that, right? So no national appropriation. We can't put fences around the moon. We can't say this place belongs to us. And more importantly, we can't prevent other countries from going anywhere. There's the principle of free access, which is similar to Antarctica, right? But one of the things we're trying to think through is that, okay, so we can't put fences, there's no property rights, but what can we do to say, hey, we're operating here. Please be careful if you come close to us. Or what if we have a radio science experiment where there can be no vibrations or no radio frequency interference within a certain range, right? What can we do? And that's where the principles of the Artemis Accords come in to say, is it possible to identify a safety zone or a way of notifying other countries saying, hey, we're going to be here on the following days doing the following activities. Please be careful. And if you come close to us, contact us. And then we can try to work it out so we don't hit each other or interfere with each other. Because there, the Outer Space Treaty is again clear, saying issues of due regard, right? We can't interfere with each other, and we have to try to consult to avoid harmful interference with each other, right? So we're not crashing into each other on the moon. And you would think too that the moon is a big place, and there's not that many countries at the end of the day that are going there. So like, you know, how is that possible? But it turns out a lot of countries are trying to go to the same place at the South Pole of the water for water resources. Or because the moon is lumpy, right? It's not a perfect sphere. The gravity of the moon is weird. So there's only a handful of orbits you can travel. So if you're going to launch an orbiter, there's only a handful of places you can go. So we're going to run into these issues sooner rather than later about making sure that we are operating in a safe manner through things like notification, through things like transparency. So no property rights, but being very open and transparent about the activities we can do so we don't hit each other. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Siendo dentro de Artemis, pero también dentro de Cosmos. Y ahí es quizás donde llegar a encontrar equilibrios, ¿no? Cuando se exploran o se extraen recursos, ese recurso que se extrae, hay otro que no lo podemos utilizar, entonces, ¿cómo se trabaja para poder compartir esos recursos, esa información, esos datos? Ese es uno de los grandes desafíos. Y hablando de desafíos de conflictos, ¿no? Uno de los principios es evitar conflictos. Y a veces desde los escritorios, por eso mencionaba mucho aspectos que tienen que ver con lo técnico, para poder bajarlo a lo concreto. A veces desde los escritorios la perspectiva de los conflictos puede ser una. Y quizás hoy en Artemis no estén algunos países, como Rusia, como China, y hay que tender esos puentes porque al final van a ir todos. Entonces, ¿cómo es la perspectiva desde alguien que está en un escritorio y que trata a veces de escribir en palabras situaciones respecto de quien está en el espacio y tiene que convivir con otra? Si la visión de un potencial conflicto es la misma o se vive diferente. Esa es una pregunta para David y por supuesto la perspectiva como astronauta. Yo que
I won't say much on the potential for conflict, but things like the Artemis Accords are designed not only to ensure the peaceful purposes of space, but create frameworks and mechanisms through which participating countries, and that can be both signatories to the Artemis Accords or non-signatories, providing that we're opening up and sharing this information, can make sure that we avoid interference with each other. I don't think we have all the answers. As we like to say, this is the beginning of a conversation. Certainly, this conversation will have to parlay into multilateral fora like UN COPIUS, and that probably is the eventual place where we will have to kind of have these broader conversations and bring in non-signatories of the Artemis Accords. There might be countries that never signed the Artemis Accords, even if they have moon missions, right? So if we can't meet them within the signatory group, we have to meet them where they are, which is the UN, right? So I think that's the place where these conversations are going, and we can use the experience of the Artemis Accords to inform, to avoid these conflicts down the road through things like information sharing, transparency, these commitments to consult to avoid harmful interference wherever appropriate.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think from an astronaut standpoint, most astronauts are more concerned about a successful mission versus conflict. And that's one of the reasons why the International Space Station is successful with all of the different nations there. That you can, conflict is going to come up, but the mission always takes first priority. But I think from an astronaut standpoint and training is how do you mitigate conflict when you are in those types of situations where you are in an isolated extreme environment like the International Space Station or on the Moon and Mars. Particularly the further you get away, the more autonomous you and your crew have to be, and figuring out how we've got to equip them with the tools and resources to be able to mitigate conflict in those types of environments. And again, I'm going to bring it back to analogs. Analog research is where you can start training and coming up with protocols and stuff to deal with conflict and ways of training way before they happen. And so there's a lot of research out there, obviously from Antarctica as one of the top analog sites, but also looking at military submarines, naval ships, all of those kinds of things where people are living in these extreme conditions and working together to accomplish things and then figuring out how to deal with the conflict. But we can't ignore it. We have to come up with solutions that and training for individuals. And a lot of that training, again, you're coming out with these career astronauts, but I can tell you civilian astronauts are going to be following quickly behind as we go to the Moon and Mars. Elon designed Starship to send massive numbers of people to Mars. They all need to train somewhere and and we've got to figure this out. We get to figure this out. And the more that we work together to try to answer these questions and build analog sites where people can come and get training and all those things, the more prepared we'll be.
Bueno, y finalmente por mi parte un poco para usando lo que él decía y que es parte de lo que se discute, sin duda hay enormes interrogantes todavía por definir, pero creo que, y es parte de lo que sin duda hay una gran coincidencia entre todos los signatarios de Artemis, es que los acuerdos de Artemis no reemplazan a los organismos multilaterales como Naciones Unidas, sino que básicamente lo que estamos es discutiendo cuestiones que luego puedan aportar a esas discusiones. O sea que creo que desde ese punto de vista sí es una ventaja que igual se está volviendo más desafiante. No eran lo mismo las discusiones cuando eran 20 los signatarios que ahora ya digamos, van a ser casi 50. Entonces, por un lado está muy bueno que cada vez más países, digamos, formen parte de los acuerdos de Artemis. Por otra parte, los desafíos para ponerse de acuerdo también se van complejizando, pero sin duda el acuerdo final no termina entre los signatarios de Artemis y es necesario un paso más que va a estar en los organismos como las Naciones Unidas.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, y ya para cerrar, vamos a buscar más, perdón. Después les hacemos una última pregunta de cierre.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por compartir todas esas experiencias. La verdad que es un desafío, pero nos das esa motivación de que, bueno, podemos viajar como, ¿no?, de civiles. Y bueno, toda la historia en realidad es fascinante. Y en función de tu viaje, te quería preguntar, Simón, digamos, en términos de la información que se recolectó en esa misión, después cómo se pudo aplicar, qué herramientas o en qué materia se pudo aplicar, ya sea en materia de biodiversidad, de preservación del ambiente, de educación ambiental también en las escuelas, en las universidades, además de, bueno, de toda tu experiencia que vos comentás y que es tan motivadora, ¿no? Pero sobre todo, bueno, esa información que se trajo, digamos, cuál fue la consecuencia y qué se pudo materializar.
Oh, really great question. And so one of the big things that came out of our mission was in biomedical research. And currently all of the data that we have in the area of human health and basically well-being through astronauts like the NASA astronauts or government agency astronauts is locked down. It's protected under, regulations of personal data. And so we, going into Inspiration 4 openly as commercial astronauts, were able to make our data openly accessible. So all of our data, all of the genetics, all of the samples, what was collected, and just about 4 months ago, 5 months ago, all of that research was publicly made available in a database that anybody around the world can access. And all of these, I think there was almost 40 papers published through Nature, the scientific magazine Nature, on all of this research and biomedical information. And that's one of the things that commercial is able to do, is that we're looking at who can fly and what are the main things that, can stop a person from going to space. How can we open up access to people who are cancer survivors or have an ailment? And the only way we can do that is by collecting this data and making it open source. And that's one of the big things that when we look at the history of NASA has been amazing as an open source repository for information that it changed the world, right? From the images to information and even the logo. I'm sure I'm going to run into somebody wearing a NASA logo here down in Argentina, because it's a brand that is well known everywhere because it's a lot of it's open source, but the one area that it's not is in that personal medical data. And civil space commercial space has come in and been able to fill that gap. Now, my concern on commercial space is that because these are private commercial space industries or companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, that the amount of data that is accessible through civil organizations like NASA is going to diminish because a lot of these companies don't want to make their technology open and the things that they're doing open because they want to not limit the competition's ability to use that information. And in the end, that I think about the rich history we've had with civil space and all of the amazing information that we've openly shared as a result of that. And so how do we come together and put pressure on a lot of these space agencies, not space agencies, these space companies, and say, we want you to figure out how to share as much information as you possibly can openly so that the world can learn and grow and do these things. And so it's going to be a challenge, I think, but it's important for us to start having these conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bueno, cerramos con eso. Sí. No, cerramos.
Well, guys, thank you very much for your presentation. I have to say that it has been a childhood dream always to go to space, so it's great to hear that you guys are working on democratizing space travel. Thank you for that. I have one last question though. I don't know how much you can comment on that, but for me there's I have boring, when I think about Donald Trump, Elon Musk, billionaires controlling technologies exclusively, diversity and inclusion, and democratizing space. How does that fit together? I don't know how much.
Believe me, I have my concerns also. I flew on a SpaceX rocket through winning a contest via Twitter, now X. So this is the only way to. We have to work towards pushing the narrative that we want forward. And we can't let the power and position of a few take over that narrative. And I think one of the ways that we do that is through things like Artemis and bringing nations together and saying, this is what we want, regardless of what the private billionaire individuals are trying to mandate. And I think that it's an important discussion to have. But you can't have the discussion if you're not involved. And so I think that is very relevant and timely to think about how do we create that Jedi space, that just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, when you have individuals that are coming in and controlling the narrative who aren't necessarily pro DEI and Jedi space. But we can change that. We just need our voices to be heard.
Bueno, vamos a cerrar con una última pregunta para cada uno. La actividad espacial es una actividad multidisciplinaria que destina inclusive se enseña derecho, porque a las mujeres se les suele decir que tienen que estudiar derecho de familia, los valores de derecho común, sociedad. Pero ciencias, todo lo que tiene que ver con la tecnología, es algo muy inclusivo. ¿Qué mensaje puede dar cada uno desde su formación, desde su perspectiva, ya que hoy hemos tomado este encuentro como un encuentro inspirador? ¿Qué mensaje puede dar jóvenes para acá y a los más grandes, que tenemos la responsabilidad de abrir el camino a los más jóvenes en esto de qué hacer cuando se quieren ser grandes?
Yes, my message is, it's really simple. I would not have made it to space had I not openly used my creativity, what I call my space, to inspire myself and those around me. My motto, Space to Inspire, isn't about outer space. It's about the space that makes you who you are. There will only ever be one of you. And how you use your unique space, the space that makes you you, how you use your space to inspire not only yourself, but those around you and beyond matters. So the things that you do, the things that you say, how you interact with each other, this matters. And if you do it in a way that is thoughtful, where you're actually trying to actively every day create Jedi space, that just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive space for yourself, and your family, and your friends, and your community, and the people around you, then you're going to be able to open up access and change the world in ways that you never really ever imagined. And so those of you who are seasoned individuals, you have power and position to create Jedi space as a foundation for how you and your company or your organization or as a leader operate, and set the role model, actively set and be the role model for that type of environment. And then the people who are coming up and are going to be the future leaders, you can instill that responsibility of them to tap into who they are and their creative selves, to not only let that into the world and be creative and share those talents that they have, but then also do it in a way that promotes Jedi space.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
David?
Thank you.
No.
I'll just say very quickly, one of the profound pleasures of things like this, interacting with this community, meeting Siam, is that there's a place for all of us, regardless of your background. So I'm a sociologist by training. I studied space scientists for many years. So I was a weird guy watching space scientists work, writing notes, interviewing people, right? But then in the process learned about space science itself, learned about space policy and space law. And it's a valuable perspective that I bring to particular conversations, which is to say, you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, right? There's all kinds of, within the vast ecosystem of space policy, law, and exploration, a place for all of us. And we're making that happen with events like this, bringing Cyan around, and then the future generation to come.
I agree.
Bueno, sí, un poco en esa línea, yo siempre digo, a veces la gente cuando se imagina, bueno, qué es ser parte del sector espacial, y yo siempre les cuento, a ver, simplemente tomando lo que nos sucede en Corea. En Corea hay biólogos marinos, hay agrónomos, estamos los ingenieros que somos los mejores por lejos, que no importa el tema.
No hay satélites sin
Claro,
abogados.
bueno, sí, exactamente. Después están los abogados. Yo pensé que iba a poner, porque no iba a haber abogados, y hay abogados, y son necesarios los abogados, como son también necesarios los diplomáticos. No, a ver, yo creo que de alguna manera todos los que estamos en el sector espacial tenemos también un poco la obligación de dar a conocer que ser parte del sector espacial no significa simplemente estar en cómo se diseña a lo mejor un satélite. Es también en cómo vamos a usar toda la información que obtenemos de un satélite, cómo le vamos a sacar provecho a toda la información que obtenemos de un satélite. Ahí es donde sin duda todo se amplifica de una manera enorme. Y por otra parte está el tema de inspirar sobre todo a los chicos, a los jóvenes y todos los programas que tenemos sobre las posibilidades. Bueno, esta mañana antes de venir para acá estábamos charlando con Hacia, y ella mencionó algo que me dejó pensando y que creo que es cierto. Ella se preparó, digamos, gran parte de su vida para un determinado momento. De pronto le dijeron que no, y después apareció otra oportunidad, pero pudo tomar esa oportunidad porque se había preparado, porque estaba lista. Y creo que eso es lo que en definitiva todos tenemos que hacer, no importa en qué estemos. Creo que era lo que ella también trataba de transmitir, tenemos que estar preparados, tenemos que estar listos para lo que sea que vayamos a querer hacer. Luego vendrán no las oportunidades, no importa, pero si la oportunidad llega y no estamos preparados, no vamos a luchar. Así que creo que el mensaje es, en el sector espacial, en cualquier otra cosa, hay que estar preparado. Después la vida de la que sucede.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Yo solamente decir a ustedes que han participado de este encuentro, que han acercado aquí a la vida, seguramente esta afirmación, este encuentro ha sido gratuito, así que no han podido estar acá. Y agradecer a todos los que han venido y le doy la palabra para que agradecieran.
Nuevamente, gracias. Creo que este encuentro ha sido realmente inspirador. No? Thank you again. I think it's been inspirational. And we've learned a lot. And well, we have to be prepared for the challenges, so we're going to keep on working. Thank you.